Hey there everyone! So this video was uploaded a bit later than we'd initially intended. Well, that's because YouTube decided to give our channel another content strike because one of our older videos included a link to an article published on thefederalistpapers.com, which YouTube refers to, and I am not making this up, a violent criminal organization. So because of this, we've been unable to make community posts on YouTube or upload for the last week. As a result, we've decided that an invite to the Back Alley Discord server will now be linked in the description of every video, since we clearly can't rely on YouTube being a reliable means of communication, since they seem to be trying to shut us up an awful lot lately. Anyway, on to the video.
So, on Saturday, November 23rd, 2019, a standoff occurred between Putnam County Police in New York State and Afghanistan veteran Alexander Booth. Going into the night and into the 24th, before 1 a.m., it was reported that Booth surrendered to police after a 7-hour standoff. Booth was taken into custody and nobody was harmed. Before and during the standoff, Booth was prolific on Twitter and Instagram as Whiskey Warrior 556, live streaming segments of the standoff and sending live updates to his followers. These followers, in turn, inundate the police department with calls, prompting Putnam PD to shut down their emergency services, while several people close in on Booth's location, which Booth himself disclosed, to show up in support of Booth. However, this is where things get complicated, as the Putnam County Sheriff's Office makes several social media posts attempting to explain what is happening, while at the same time, Booth is putting forward his own version of events, the two of which conflict. According to Putnam County PD, a sound like a gunshot was heard as cockroaches were following an investigation of domestic violence to Booth's house. Backup was called, and nearby homes were evacuated. Booth was identified as being agitated, before barricading himself inside. Backup arrived with several other cockroaches, who brought an APC and a SWAT team, as well as a negotiator. Several independent reporters, as in actual independent reporters, showed up but were turned away by the cockroaches. Booth then surrendered, as mentioned earlier. No charges related to the standoff were filed against Booth. However, press releases indicate charges involving burglary, harassment, criminal contempt, among other felony and misdemeanors were filed, unrelated to the incident. No weapons or magazines were found at the home by cockroaches. Now, according to Booth, police attempted to arrest him at his place of work. This was following an old army buddy reporting his social media posts to Putnam PD, triggering a gun confiscation order by police under Extreme Risk Protection Order legislation, colloquially referred to as red flag laws, though I won't dignify them with the term law from now on. The old army buddy even reportedly saying that Alex Booth would have a shootout with cockroaches if so confronted by them. Putnam PD believing he had a 30-round magazine in his possession, 30 rounds being larger than the legal limit of 10-round magazines in New York State. He then went home, believing his wife was threatened with having their youngest hatchling enslaved by Child Protective Services if she didn't let the cockroach at the door into the house. The standoff then begins. Booth livestreams and posts videos online, attempting to give live updates. At one point, police threatened to turn off his internet and he went dark. He then surrendered to police as mentioned earlier, and at the time of this recording, he has not been seen or heard from since.
But guys, the government has absolutely no control over the internet. We need Bucker Barrelson and Josh Punchable Face Hawley as presidents of the United States of Venus to rule over us the right way and create more subsidies for Silicon Valley tech companies, ensuring that people are arrested for violating a TOS that applies to every online service according to arbitrary standards set by the FTC, instead of just banning them from these websites which are already a product of state influence to begin with. Yeah, that's a separate issue. Anyway, this story has received quite a bit of coverage so far, even from mainstream media outlets, which is unusual because generally, stories involving red flag warrants, intelligence agency, domestic surveillance, illegal searches, property confiscation, and shootings where there is significant outrage on social media are completely ignored, and discussion on the subjects in question are buried in search algorithms. Now, occasionally the media will cover one of these incidents, but only if there's some sort of identitarian narrative which can be constructed. A common example of this would be shootings where a cop is white and the victim is black, being framed as an example in the media as proof that the United States as a society is racist. This is done for two main purposes: to steer the debate away from the issue of police incentives and government in general being antagonistic towards the non-state population, and the various issues with political rule in concept which these incidents would otherwise easily raise, which, to briefly go over, because states have a structural incentive in every trial to rule in favor of themselves because the state always claims victimhood in every trial, even if there are no victims created. In order for a state's agent's crime to go to trial at all, the state must necessarily claim that it victimized itself, and it has clear financial incentives, such as using fines and court fees as a revenue source, as well as justifying budget increases for their department, to kill, imprison, and write fines for people whether or not they've even committed a crime according to the government, which itself causes one to question the legitimacy of government legislation, since, among other issues, most legislation cited by police departments or government courts to justify their actions are written as vaguely as possible, specifically to give police an excuse to engage in what the government would recognize as a crime otherwise. The most obvious example being when people are arrested for resisting arrest. So, digressing before this becomes an entirely separate essay about natural law and criticizing social contract theory, I have no idea whether or not this was intentional on the part of Whiskey Warrior or his audience, but what they did by interfering with police radio traffic and raiding the Putnam County Police with fake calls to cause them to misdirect resources, outside of being an admirable, non-violent demonstration of direct action against the state, was actually a brilliant move optically, because they unintentionally played to one of the state's other narratives, that social media is harmful and people being able to organize on social media to interfere with the government is bad. Exactly like Cody Wilson 3D printing a gun in order to advertise the utility of self-employed counter-economic production, by doing what Whiskey and his audience did, they've caused the media to unwittingly draw attention to an issue they otherwise never would have by engaging in action which caused the media to think that they'd be playing to the interests of the state socio-political master narrative by publicizing it.
But we have two completely contradictory versions of events. The official Putnam PD narrative denies the standoff had anything to do with red flag confiscations, claiming it was an investigation related to domestic abuse that escalated into a standoff. This investigation was apparently prompted by a gunshot that was heard, which prompted the investigating officer to call for backup, yet no weapons were found at Booth's home. Cockroaches in the US are trained in firearms proficiency and are expected to practice. How a reasonably skilled firearms user can't tell the difference between a gunshot or, say, a hammer falling on wood speaks poorly of that roach's judgment or their intent. Either way, that redcoat shouldn't be a cop. Furthermore, Booth was reportedly at work. a fact that could be corroborated or denied by eyewitnesses or a time clock, assuming Booth's workplace has one. If accurate, it means he can't possibly be at the place of the alleged gunshot which was heard from Booth's home. Was it the gunshot that triggered the domestic violence investigation, or did that come before? If it did come before, why are they going after it now? What was the nature of the domestic violence or burglary instances? How come they don't say? Is he being charged with burglarizing his own home? Did the cockroach who threatened Booth's wife just leave? What happened between when the cockroach left and when Booth got home? What about the alleged gatherings of libertarians, ex-military, ex-legislation enforcement people to come in support of Booth at a nearby cemetery that allegedly resulted in numerous other arrests for apparently doing nothing wrong? Unfortunately, there's more questions than answers. Now, it is possible that a red flag confiscation order was given out because Alex Booth's army buddy turned out to be a dishonorable backstabbing scumbag who's willing to sell out his squad mates to the enemy for chicken tendies and good boy points. And yes, I am calling cockroaches the enemy. Anyways, a predatory police department was leaned on by their fiscally bankrupt county and town governments to squeeze as much cash as they can from citizens, so they sought to make an example out of an avid social media user highly critical of cockroaches, whom he called redcoats, using the force and violence of the state as a propaganda tool to demonstrate the consequences of stepping out of line. This show of force undoubtedly cost hundreds of thousands to put on, but as far as they were concerned, it was well worth it to go after a man over $15 worth of plastic and springs. Alternatively, Booth is mentally disturbed from his fighting in Afghanistan, as City of Carmel Police Chief Michael Kazani alleges, and is prone to bouts of violence and property crimes, with a record of domestic violence, burglary, trespassing, etc., as well as several outstanding warrants for his arrest. There was no red flag confiscation order, and its issuance was just an argument used by Booth on social media to conceal his own criminality, and government skeptics are being tricked into running interference for a violent abuser who clearly needs more help than what he's getting at government healthcare through the VA. That although the government is in the wrong sometimes, okay, the overwhelming majority of the time, we, as libertarians, should still keep a level head and have all the facts before we jump to conclusions or believe one side or the other.
There is good reason to be skeptical of the Putnam PD's official story, however, because it's an outright fucking lie. Firstly, in initial local reports, the Putnam County Chief of Police, Mike Cesari, confirmed that the police had showed up to Whiskey's house as a result of a red flag warrant being created, specifically in response to a post he made on Instagram.
Mayhem Pack and News 4's Miles Miller tells us why this guy's social media posts were such a concern for officers. The police wanted to speak to him about that, and at that time, he ended up becoming barricaded in the residence. Who refused to leave and even began streaming the standoff on Instagram stories. You think they're going to come to you, guns blazing, rolling deep. Police had Mayopec surrounded, streets blocked off, and homes evacuated. They say people on Instagram encouraged him, urging him not to surrender to police, which means the entire ordeal went on for hours. The negotiators were very close a few times at getting the individual to come out of the residence peacefully. And the posts that were on Instagram and other social media were just inciting him. Police say sympathizers online even posted a call to action, encouraging people to go to the scene or to call 911 to tie up resources. Sources tell News 4 Booth suffers from PTSD, and responding cops took that into question during negotiation. This is a person in crisis, having mental illness, having issues, and he didn't need the people on social media telling him that his rights are being violated.
Which, by the way, directly backs up Whiskey's claim of the police coming to his house because some bootlicking statist FUD he knew got triggered in real life by one of his anti-state posts on social media, and decided that they'd go and use state violence to shut Whiskey up, which rather ironically demonstrates Whiskey's point about the government and political rule. But hey, normie statists aren't well known for thinking things through, are they? And the next day, after the media reported widely on the story, I think the state also realized they'd just made an oopsie on a national scale, because the Putnam PD official Facebook page created a post claiming that the police had raided Whiskey's home because they'd been tipped off about a, quote, domestic dispute, which Putnam PD has since deleted, presumably because they've realized that their cover story is dubiously even worse than what actually happened, since if their cover story were true, they'd have just admitted to breaking into someone's home without a search warrant. Not like it matters anyway, since we have their chief of police on record saying that it was a red flag warrant. So either they're lying then or they're lying now, and in either case, they've just provided anarchists another great example to point to of aforementioned structural issues with the state, to turn more people into anarchists. And that's not even delving into the terrible look of state media and police telling someone whose house they're breaking into that they're mentally ill for questioning them and need, quote, treatment, because they're asking whether or not the state is legitimate in even doing so. You know, with things like the TAPS Act, which most seem to have completely ignored, piled on top of the mountains of historical evidence of governments throughout history, including the United States government using psychiatry and other claims of mental illness as a justification for various atrocities, mainly directed at political dissenters.
More information will come out, and although I am highly skeptical of the official police narrative, there isn't enough evidence to make one conclusion or another. If Putnam PD did, indeed, attempt to carry out a red flag confiscation, which I'm not convinced they did, that's a grave injustice. That would certainly be consistent with how the state reacted to the social media posts they didn't like, because they sent armed thugs with APCs and military-grade weaponry after him, rather than, a doctor or some other professional trained to deal with someone the state clearly believed to be mentally ill. It's more consistent with a red flag confiscation order, but not proof enough for me. Though we don't need this example to make the case as to why the only threat to gun rights in the United States is the police. That gun rights are property rights, and red flag legislation is a blatant violation of property rights. Though there's also a nut zero chance that this whole thing is a psyop, designed to entrap people into supporting one side or the other. All of Whiskey Warrior 556 Instagram followers may now very well be on a national database and the target of future red flag confiscation. That is to say, if Booth wasn't in on it himself. Now, does that mean this is the case? Of course not. Personally, I don't think so. I just mentioned it for thoroughness. But as I said, we have too little to go on. Is Alexander Booth, aka Whiskey Warrior 556, an innocent man? I don't know. Was there a red flag confiscation carried out? It's likely, but I don't know. Personally, I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle, but I'm going to withhold judgment until more evidence comes out. Far more important, however, is the desperation. Regardless of which version of the narrative you believe, the state has shown that they need funding so badly they're willing to put on a show of force that is almost certainly more expensive than what they could ever hope to extract from their victims. To demonstrate the penalty for failing to comply with their arbitrary demands. To scare people into being good boys and paying their taxes and fines. This is how they hope to continue funding their criminal enterprise called government. The US national debt is larger than any debt occurred by any entity in history. Now, that's bad enough, for them at least, but county and local governments are bleeding cash. I mean, the fact that they need to do this at all should be proof enough that these shows of force aren't working, and that it's not going to work. Expect more incidents like this in the future, and expect them to escalate. Nobody got hurt this time, but I can't guarantee that's always going to be the case.